Andy Mitton's with us. Laurie Whitwell is with us as well. Good evening, gentlemen. We will talk about transfers. My goodness, we'll try and squeeze them in somewhere. We'll try and work out exactly who has been writing rubbish about Cristiano Ronaldo, and there's two guilty faces looking back at me right now. But of course, there's only one place to start, and that is the interest from Sir Jim Ratcliffe about a potential bid for Manchester United. It's been reported in the Times. Laurie, what can you say about it?
Yeah, it's something that's been rumoured for a little bit now, certainly since the start of the season, really, and the kind of focus that's been on the Glazers. The ownership has certainly come under more scrutiny, hasn't it, with the results going the way they have, the protests the fans are organising, gathering a bit of pace and not going away. But this does feel like a significant moment where you've got a guy who's, very wealthy man, I think at one point Britain's richest man, many billions in the bank, and has already tried to buy one club, or at least made a bid, which we might get on to in terms of whether that was serious or whether that was a stalking horse for this real attempt to buy a different Premier League club when he went into for Chelsea at the end of the bidding process last season. But the fact that he's come out, or at least his spokesman has come out and said he would be interested in buying a stake in Manchester United and talking about a reset that needs to be done and how important the club is for the city. It's not a short statement in the end. It's actually kind of a detailed one, really. It is talking in hypotheticals, if the club is for sale, but we had the Bloomberg report earlier in the day that spoke about people close to the Glazers suggesting that they would be open to selling a minority stake, and we can have a debate about what that means, what that might look like, why now, what the realities of it would be, but it does feel like a kind of significant moment.
It does feel like a moment, doesn't it? Definitely, especially with the protests that are planned for the Liverpool game, which we'll talk about later on in the podcast, of course. And even the statement in itself, the time is right for a reset. Any talk of a takeover is going to get Manchester United fans excited, of course, because of the popularity or otherwise of the current ownership. But that statement in particular, how excited should Manchester United fans be?
I think there's excitement, and I can understand why. We've spoke many times about the Glazers and their unpopularity among Manchester United fans. I think in recent weeks and months that's been building and building. It seems to feel a little bit different in recent weeks. The media has been extremely critical of the Glazer family, and I think a lot of United fans will take hope from the fact that Britain's richest man, he's a Mancunian, he grew up as a Manchester United fan, has come out, or his spokesman has, and said that he is interested in taking over Manchester United. It is explicit. I want to buy Manchester United, says Jim Ratcliffe. And I think if you polled Manchester United fans now, 90% of them would ask, if asked yes or no, would say yes to that. There's no perfect owner at all. I don't actually think Manchester United need to be owned by anybody. The club's big enough to stand on its own 2 feet, but let's be realistic here. The club is where it is, with the Glazers owning the club and having total power. So I think it's going to be a long, long way ahead. I don't think anything's going to be happening overnight, and I think that Jim Ratcliffe would have to build a stake and build it up and up with the long-term view of taking full control. I've never been given any indication that the Glazers are looking to sell Manchester United, so I don't want to put a dampener on it. I think something's happening.
Yeah, it's not about putting a dampener on it, is it? It's about providing some context for fans who are wondering what this means.
Yeah, I've been speaking to people every day who know far, far more about the financial market than I do. Manchester United's got a big fan base, and within that fan base, naturally, statistically, there's going to be some people who work extremely high up in the world of finance and economics. I've been speaking to them all of the time, and they've been saying things like, rhetorically, yes, Manchester United will be for sale at a ridiculous price, but are the Glazers just looking to get an idiot to invest in a chunk and have no real proper say in the running of Manchester United? One of them said to me yesterday, I really hope the fan revolt gets much bigger. The Glazers have got to go. And people have got very strong opinions about the Glazers. We know that from the fans, but people who work in the industry as well, they do not think that they're competent owners for Manchester United, and I think it's pretty easy to argue that case.
The gross debt stands at 596 million, which is pretty much where it was when Manchester United were taking over in that leverage buyout, of course, back when the Glazers first took charge. And Matt writes as well that there's a sense from the New York Stock Exchange that they're sort of suggesting investors that it's time to go, because the stock price has fallen from $14, US dollars that is, in 2012 when Manchester United were first floated, down to last week, $11.5 roughly, or $11.55 to say it in a more normal way. All these figures have got me confused already. But that's gone up 10% since, because of takeover speculation. Kieran Maguire's quoted in that piece as well, who does the Price of Football blog, talking about the Glazers getting something like a 2,000 return on investment, and that's placing the valuation at something like 2.6 billion. And Andy's already said on this podcast that it could well be north of that, the valuation. There's a really interesting Twitter thread as well from the Swiss Ramble, talking about just how many dividends they've taken. Of course, the only team in the Premier League that's subject to their owners taking dividends is Manchester United at the moment. The interest payments over the last 12 years are nearly as much as the rest of the Premier League combined. Over the last decade, Manchester United owners have taken 154 million out of the club, and that compares to 684 million for Manchester City's owners that they've put in. Whichever way you look at any of the stats, any of the facts that any of the people have presented, Laurie, it doesn't make great reading, does it?
No, we did a piece in May 2020, just as the pandemic was gripping on the Glazers, 10,000 word piece that tried to get to grips with how the takeover happened, how it was allowed to happen, as Andy's touched on earlier in different podcasts. The playable government and FA sort of stepped aside really when they could have shown their teeth and actually blocked this from happening, because it was loading the club with an awful lot of debt that wasn't necessarily going to work. It was kind of quite fortunate at one point that they sort of squeaked through, and going on into how much it's actually cost the club. I think there's different totals, but we kind of think that it's cost Manchester United £1.5 billion for the privilege of being owned by the Glazers, something like that, maybe even north of that now. And they spent £270 million of their own money acquiring the shares, and then getting that stake so that they could force that leverage takeover. They've already made profit on that £270 million, in terms of the dividends, as we spoke about, but in terms of the IPO, management fees, and now in terms of share sales that keep happening. So you had Avram at one point, you had Kevin and Ed Glazer selling shares, all that money going to them rather than the club. Now this is the kind of big question about this potential sale of a minority stake. Where would that money go? Is it part of these conversations where United are looking at actually building a stadium? And it would be a huge step change if the Glazers did do this, because they haven't ever done this in terms of putting what is theoretically their own money, because they could just pocket it if they sold some shares, into the club. But how else would you raise funds for a stadium? You can acquire more debt, but we know they're in talks with fan groups about how they proceed with the stadium. Can they really countenance having more debt on the club when it's been there for such a long time and it's not got any smaller? So actually selling some equity in the club would at least raise funds there. Clearly you could do sponsorship, clearly the Glazers could fund it themselves, but that's not going to happen. So equity is one avenue for that. So if that is part of this, and then the long-term goal is that actually, why would the Glazers do that? Because it would be a huge change. I know Joel started speaking to the fans, that's been a big change since the Super League, but this would be something else. Is it because they, generally think, Joel and Avram now think, actually, let's do this, we've changed our minds? Or is it because maybe, and they've got to get the other siblings to agree to this, by the way, it's interesting. I'm really curious about that dynamic, who, I'm not sure they always agree on all these things in terms of share sales, in terms of what to do going forward with the club. But would they ultimately see that as a long-term benefit, where the value of the club having a new stadium, which making a lot more money, which people enjoy spending time in, over time, that increases the value of the club, and therefore, that the share sale that they do now is actually turns into profit, because they can then put the money back in the club. Listen, we're talking a long time in the future. We're kind of hypothesizing here, but I can see why people get excited about a potential for a sale of the club, because people have just got so frustrated with how it's run under the Glazers. They've not been good owners at all, taken money out of the club. The team is in decline. The commercial revenues aren't even going up anymore. They're in decline, really.
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And then you've got Man City and Liverpool picking up.
Sorry, Laurie. Yeah, I was going to say that's been a big defence of the ownership in the past, hasn't it? That they've grown the commercial revenues. I mean, it's a fact that it's tripled since they took over commercial revenue. However, since 2017, it's dropped 15%. That's not a trend that shows that the progress is still being made. Like you say, Manchester City and Liverpool both making up the gap, or even taking over Manchester United. Andy.
Yeah, it slowed down. And that's partly because Manchester United are less successful, and partly because others have copied Manchester United's ideas. I remember a chat 7 or 8 years ago that Barcelona and Real Madrid looked to Manchester United as a club that they copied commercially. You have words like megastore, which have just become normal in the English language, which came out of Old Trafford. United really were commercial trailblazers. And while the commercial revenues are still substantial, and some of the other sponsorship deals at other clubs are suspicious, to my mind, some of the fees that they're getting, United has plateaued. And some of those, I remember the Chevrolet deal, thinking, how on earth have they managed to pull that one out the bag? But I wasn't thinking that with the TeamViewer. TeamViewer have already said that they're not going to renew the next shirt sponsor. United have continued to confound sceptics saying that there's no commercial appeal, but it's just common sense. If United are not playing Champions League football, then they're going to be less attractive. It's just common sense, and people want to attach themselves to successful brands, not brands which are mired in controversy or where the fans are up in arms because of the owners.
And the Adidas deal, if they don't qualify for the Champions League for a second year in a row, comes down by 30%, which I think is like 22.5 million. Now, there are ways in terms of accounting that they can offset that. We've spoken to people and fine, but it's ultimately a real cost to the club for failure in football terms, which is always a thing that Ed Woodward, claimed wrongly that wouldn't affect them. Whatever happens on the pitch, we can still make money off it. And now the Glazers will claim that they were the ones with this foresight of commercial activity where, okay, forget having these exclusive partnerships with a few select companies. Let's spread it all over the globe, have regional partners. Let's get the name out there and we'll make loads more money. Now they, when you criticise the Glazer ownership, they will say, we've added that to the club, so that's a value that we've added. I mean, I don't really buy that because, I think anybody would have thought maybe that's a way to go. And also, it's not actually now still paying dividends, is it? Pardon the pun. And there was also in the piece that we talked about that we did, the big Glazer read that we did in May 2020, we spoke to people that used to be at the club working, and they said they had actually gone down a path of making it a bit more exclusive, and they thought that would actually bring more value to those individual sponsorships because of the fact that it was a kind of prestige association. And it starts off with a story of the first time they were at Old Trafford, three of the brothers, and they turned to people in the director's box. I think Rooney had scored, and they said, "What happens to the ball?" Which, forgive me doing that impersonation, but that's how it was told to me. And basically their question was, does that ball not now get kind of sold off as like an item like it does in baseball? I think if a baseball gets hit for a home run or something, you can auction it off and it has a value. So they were always thinking about these ways of adding value to the club, or of seeing how you could commercialise different aspects to it. So go and have a read of that if you've not already. But I do want to make just one more point, if I can, on the fact that fans are getting excited, and a few I've seen online that are saying, this is the bigger picture. This is really why United aren't spending this window and are kind of having, a bit of a scramble to the finish. It's two totally separate things. They're not associated. This is a long-term thing that may or may not even happen. It's kind of the origins of something. It's a conversation happening. It's exciting for sure because it's a step change in what we've had before. We had Saudi Arabia were rumoured to be interested, weren't they, in a kind of takeover, and I think ultimately they did offer a 20% stake that they wanted to kind of buy. Didn't go anywhere. But this is different because you've got a guy saying, I want to buy Manchester United, and he's got the resources opportunities for it. But it's two different things in terms of people getting excited over the transfer activity.
This Monday has the potential for the biggest protest since the Liverpool game was postponed, doesn't it? I mean, all of this is only going to add to the feeling, isn't it?
Well, you said an interesting thing before we started recording, didn't you? And I'm kind of interested to maybe pick up on it a little bit. But does this take the pin a little bit out of or does this diffuse the kind of the building angst that there is amongst United fans? The fact that there could be light at the end of the tunnel, if you want the Glazers to be gone. So I don't know. I kind of feel like people will ultimately still have the anger that they do have about the results, about the fact that the transfer market seems to just be this one mad scramble around Europe for whoever is available, when we can chuck a load of money at it eventually and there's no strategy behind it. But I do wonder, will some people be a little bit softened? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, no, I think there is a sense that I've seen certainly online and speaking to other United fans that people feel like the direct action that has been taking place over the course of the last year or so, or even longer, it is what's leading to people having an interest in buying a club, is what's giving people like Sir Jim Ratcliffe hope that it could be achievable to take over Manchester United, that the Glazers might sell because of just how negative the groundswell of opinion is. So if that's the case, Andy, that maybe means that more people are going to get behind the process on Monday and get behind the idea that they're unhappy with who currently owns the club.
Yeah. We've seen a protest before the Brighton game, people meeting up in Salford Quays and walking to the ground. 75,000 people can't do that. The Manchester United's demographic is so wide. I had a mate message me the other day, I'm going with my little lad, is there going to be trouble at the game on Monday? What should I do? So everyone's got different questions. And the club, I think, respect the fact that fans are allowed to protest as long as it's done in a peaceful manner. I've seen stuff online about empty Old Trafford, but if you can't anchor that into someone in real life or something with credibility, I think it's very difficult to pull something like that off. And I think asking people to boycott the match has always been fraught. And sometimes there's a lot of noise online, but in reality, it is completely the opposite of that. If Manchester United are struggling against Liverpool in the match on Monday, I think you could have a natural reaction. And I think English football fans are often best with their natural reactions. So we often look with envy at the ultra groups on the continent. And I've put that to a few players over the years, and they've come back to me and went, no. When you're attacking in an English ground, that roar, that reaction to what the fans are seeing is one of the best things that can happen to a footballer. And I was quite struck by that. And conversely, if things are bad, I think the feeling is mutinous at the moment, because if Liverpool were 4 up as they were in the equivalent fixture last season at half-time, I think that would be the straw which breaks the camel's back for a lot of moderate Manchester United fans. I'm not on about politicised United fans. I'm not on about ones who are more naturally drawn to protest, younger people who are up for a chant or waving a flag or whatever. If you start to lose the moderates, I remember you giving an example with Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, 2nd of October last year. I said, he's starting to lose the moderates here. And he lost them. He never got them back, and he lost his job 6 weeks later. And I think that sensible Manchester United fans who might not have any interest in the politics, and I've got a long history in fan politics, I've seen what the different types of people are, they would have a breaking point as well. And if United were on the way to losing the third game at the start of the season, I think you're going to see a major real-life reaction. What form that takes, we don't know. But it might just be that natural reaction. It's going to be on television, and fans can show many ways of showing their disdain.
It reminds me of the Burnley game, before lockdown, January 2020, I think it was, where it got mutinous, and then eventually United signed Bruno Fernandes. But to what extent does that actually affect the Glazers in terms of actually selling the club? Because they are capitalists. Do they really care what happens in Manchester? I mean, the Super League did affect them, definitely. The fact that they got the match called off and it went all over the globe, those pictures, that's a significant event. I do think that you've got the potential for some real tension in the stands if United do start to lose to Liverpool, and whether that then bleeds into what the Glazers think, I don't know. But it's curious, because I'll sort of finish on this from my point of view. But why would the Glazers sell now? So the idea was that they would get in the Super League, and then that would secure revenue for a number of years, in perpetuity, really, at a high level, and the value of the club would rocket. $10 billion people were talking about. So that's out the window. So why would they then sell now? They could kind of keep going. But actually, the price that Chelsea went for has kind of raised the market value, really. They've kind of thought, actually, you can get a lot of premium on our... So the current price is at like $2.5 billion, I think, something like that. It was $4 billion when the Saudis, I think, were rumoured to be looking at interest. And that was kind of, okay, you thought $2 billion on top of that for, what is on top of market value, maybe that could work. So, but now you're talking about two and a bit billion. Would they really? They could maybe even get that $6 billion. So maybe they're looking at it thinking, this is actually our time to potentially sell. This is maybe the best moment to do it, and get a real good return. That's just one sort of school of thought. I don't know how real that is when you come to it, but so why now? That's potentially why now. If they think that the Chelsea thing has really changed the dynamics of it all, which, as we mentioned earlier, Jim Radcliffe came in at the end and made a sort of cheeky late bid, despite the whole process being open.
Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Weeks long, exactly. You sort of wonder, is that, yeah, exactly. He knows he can fit right in at Manchester
Cheeky
United, can't
bids.
he? Yeah. But was that a kind of just a shot across the bows, I suppose, to say, okay, and there's this idea that he was also a Chelsea fan, as a kid, or he's been to Chelsea matches certainly in his adult life. But was that a sign to say, okay, I'm actually going to I'm putting my money here for Chelsea, but really I'm serious about owning a football club later down the line?